Hey everyone, and welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're tackling a question that's fascinated humans, well, probably forever. What's really going on inside the mind of a chimpanzee? You've sent in tons of research, a lot of it from Dr. Daniel Povinelli's Folk Physics for Apes. So let's unpack it.
And this book, it doesn't mess around. Povinelli really challenges us to rethink some pretty basic assumptions about our closest living relatives.
He really does. It's dense, it's thought-provoking, and it might just leave you looking at those chimpanzee tool use videos online a little differently. What I found fascinating is Pavanelli doesn't just present experiments. He digs into like the philosophy behind how we even interpret animal behavior.
Absolutely, and that's crucial because it's so easy to fall into the trap of what Povinelli calls the argument by analogy.
Okay, so unpack that for us. What is the argument by analogy and why does it matter so much?
Well, it's something we all do, probably without even realizing it. You see a chimp using a stick to, say, fish for termites, just like a human might. And you think, okay, they're using tools. They must understand cause and effect, just like me. But Pavanelli's saying, hold on a second. That jump from similar behavior to similar thinking, that's the argument by analogy. And it can lead us to some pretty shaky conclusions.
So just because a chimp acts like it understands physics, that doesn't mean it thinks about physics the way we do.
Exactly. And one of the most, I think, compelling examples Povinelli uses is chimpanzee gaze following. You know, how they'll follow your gaze to see what you're looking at. On the surface, it seems like they totally get that you're looking at something specific, that you're interested in something. But then Povinelli does these other experiments where chimps just consistently fail to grasp seeing as a mental experience. Like, they don't seem to understand that if your vision is blocked, you can't see something.
So which is it? Do they understand our gaze or do they not? It almost seems like those experiments contradict each other.
That's what's so great about Povinelli's approach. He doesn't shy away from those apparent contradictions. Instead, he kind of digs deeper. He proposes that chimps might be following a different set of rules based on their own way of experiencing the world. Like, think of it this way. They might understand the mechanics of vision. Someone looking in a certain direction usually means there's something interesting there, but without necessarily understanding the mental state of seeing itself.
Okay, that's kind of blowing my mind. It's like they're reading our behavior without necessarily understanding the thoughts behind it at all.
Exactly. And to illustrate this, Povinelli brings up Chimp World, this sort of artificial chimpanzee society that he created. What's so fascinating is that the chimps in Chimp World, even though they don't necessarily have a human-like theory of mind, they can still engage in these incredibly complex social interactions.
That's wild. So it's like they're incredible actors playing their social roles based on instinct and learned responses, but not necessarily because they're thinking, this is what the other chimp is thinking or feeling.
Precisely. And that leads us to Povinelli's next big area of investigation. How do chimpanzees understand cause and effect, particularly when it comes to using tools? Because if there's one thing we associate with chimps, it's their impressive tool use.
Which brings us, of course, to that classic image, chimpanzees and tools. I'm talking like stacking boxes to reach those tempting, just out of reach bananas. It just seems like such a clear example of problem solving, of understanding basic physics, you know?
Right. And that's exactly what Povinelli wants us to question. He really digs into the cognitive steps involved and shows us why what seems so obvious to us might not be so simple for a chimp. See, we humans, we have this intuitive understanding of gravity, of support we just get, that a stack of boxes will stay upright. But do chimpanzees share that same intuitive physics? Povinelli's research really suggests that they might not, at least not in the same way.
So how did Pavanelli figure that out? Because from what I read, this book is just packed with years of like meticulously designed experiments. Trap tubes, trap tables, flimsy tools, you name it, he's designed an experiment around it.
This is where folk physics for apes gets really interesting. Each experiment is like a window into how chimpanzees are thinking about tools and cause and effect. So one experiment that really highlights this difference is the rake and food study. Imagine this. A chimp has to choose between two rakes to try and get a piece of food. One rake is simply touching the food, while the other has the food resting on top of it. Okay, I mean, it seems pretty obvious which rake to choose. Even I can understand that the one with the food resting on it is the way to go. Exactly. But here's the thing. Chimpanzees in these experiments, they didn't consistently choose that rake. And this gets to the heart of Povinelli's argument. Chimpanzees seem to rely more on what they can directly perceive, so like contact, proximity, rather than abstract concepts like support or physical connection. They're not necessarily thinking this rake is supporting the food. Instead, they're probably going, the food is right there next to the rake, so that must be the one.
So they're not little physicists in the making, but they're still incredibly adept at navigating their world. It makes you wonder, what is going on in those chimp brains when they are successfully using tools?
That is the million-dollar question. Povinelli proposes that instead of relying on physics like we do, chimps might be using what he calls perceptual motor intelligence. Basically, it's about being incredibly attuned to the details of your surroundings. Learning through trial and error and developing this whole repertoire of actions that work in very specific situations. They might not be pondering the why, but their how is undeniably effective.
So instead of approaching a problem with these abstract concepts, they're drawing on this incredible library of experiences like, "Oh, okay, this worked before in this situation, so I'll try it again."
Yes. And that kind of intelligence, it makes perfect sense for a chimpanzee's environment, where survival often depends on quick thinking and adapting to constantly changing circumstances.
It almost reminds me of those like choose your own adventure books we read as kids. Like they're following a path based on what they've learned from experience. Like if this happens, then I do that. It might not be abstract reasoning, but it's clearly a successful strategy for them.
Absolutely. Now, while Povinelli observed this trend in a lot of his research, there were a few chimps who seemed to challenge his findings, at least on the surface. And one chimp in particular really stood out, Jadine.
Ah, Jadine, the like chimpanzee superstar. I read about her in the book. She was Povinelli's like star pupil, right?
She is one of those chimps who, at times, seem to grasp something a little deeper, something beyond just that perceptual motor intelligence we were talking about. There's this one experiment where she's given a tool, but it's too long to fit through an opening. Now, most chimps, they would just keep trying to force it, To Jadine, she actually shortens the tool by biting off a piece.
Wow, okay, that's seriously impressive. So how do we square that with Povinelli's idea that chimps rely more on learned behaviors? Was Jadine on the verge of like some next-level chimpanzee thinking?
That's the question that makes Jadine's case so fascinating and so tricky, because it really highlights the challenges of interpreting individual differences in animal research. Was she an exceptionally, I don't know, smart chimpanzee working within the bounds of chimp cognition, but like pushing those boundaries? Or was she hinting at a latent capacity for more abstract thought, something closer to our own human way of thinking? Povinelli, he really grapples with these questions throughout the book.
It makes you realize just how complex these questions of animal intelligence really are. Like there's always more to uncover, more to learn.
Absolutely. And speaking of more to uncover, Povinelli doesn't just stop at tool use. He also dives into another fascinating aspect of chimpanzee minds, self-awareness.
Okay, so we're moving beyond physics and into the realm of the self now. This is where things get really interesting. Do chimps have a sense of self in the way that we do?
Right. And to explore this, Povinelli dives into another classic animal intelligence test, mirror self-recognition. You've probably seen those videos. A chimp is marked with a dab of paint, usually on their forehead, and then they're given access to a mirror.
Oh yeah, we've all seen those, right? The chimp like looks in the mirror, sees that mark, and then touches their own forehead, almost as if to say, hey, that's me. I mean, it seems like pretty clear evidence of self-awareness, doesn't it?
It is, right? It's incredibly compelling to watch. But just like with the tool use, Povinelli wants us to dig just a little deeper. See, passing the mirror test is often seen as this gold standard for self-awareness, but Povinelli argues that we need to be careful about what we conclude from it.
Okay, I'm intrigued. So if recognizing yourself in a mirror isn't proof of a self, what is it proof of then?
Well, Povinelli proposes that chimpanzees, at least in this context, might just be treating the mirror as a tool for like exploring their own bodies.
Mm,
They might not be thinking that's me in the mirror in that same way that a human would,
right.
It might be more like as my reflection and it's got something on its head, better check myself. Remember that perceptual motor intelligence we were talking about? They're masters of using their bodies and tools to interact with the world around them. So the mirror in this case, it kind of just becomes another tool in their like repertoire.
So it's like they're understanding the mechanics of the mirror, how it works, without necessarily understanding that deeper philosophical concept of self that we humans tend to project onto it.
Exactly. It goes right back to that argument by analogy we talked about earlier. Just because they behave in a way that seems self-aware doesn't mean their experience of that behavior is actually the same as what we experience.
Yeah.
It might be a totally different type of awareness, shaped by their unique evolutionary history and how they experience the world.
Man, this whole conversation just makes you wonder, like, What is it like to be a chimp, to experience the world with their senses, their intelligence, but without that, that constant internal monologue that we humans seem to have?
It really is a question, and it's one that has fascinated philosophers and scientists for centuries. And unfortunately, we may never truly have a definitive answer. But by trying to understand the chimpanzee mind on its own terms, we can at least start to appreciate the incredible diversity of intelligence that exists on this planet.
And maybe, in the process, even shed a little light on our own brand of intelligence. And Povinelli definitely doesn't shy away from turning the mirror back on us humans a little bit and questioning some of our assumptions, right?
And this is where I think his research gets really interesting. So remember how we were talking about how chimps seem to rely so much on what they can directly perceive, what's right in front of them? Well, Povinelli proposes that this reliance on the kind of observable might actually make them, in some ways, more rational than us humans.
Okay, now that is a thought I was not expecting. How could our ability to reason, to think abstractly, how could that possibly make us less rational?
Well, think about it. Our ability to reason about things we can't actually see or touch, while incredibly powerful, also opens the door to, like, biases, to irrational beliefs. We fall prey to superstitions. We start to believe in things like luck or fate. Our emotions, they can and do cloud our judgment. And then there's confirmation bias, where we just look for information that confirms what we already believe, even if it's not true.
It's true. We humans are experts at clinging to our own beliefs, even when presented with tons of contradictory evidence. It's like sometimes we prioritize feeling good over actually being rational.
Yes, exactly. Chimpanzees, with their focus on what they can directly observe what's right there, they might actually be less susceptible to those types of biases. Their decisions, they're more likely grounded in what they've learned from their own direct experiences, in what's right in front of them. It's a fascinating idea, right? Could our very capacity for abstract thought, that thing that makes us human, could it also make us more prone to irrationality?
That's a humbling thought for sure. Maybe true rationality then isn't just about pure logic and analysis. Maybe it's also about being present, being attentive to our senses, and maybe even being a little humble about what we think we know.
It really does make us rethink our place in the grand scheme of things. We tend to just put humans at the very top of that intelligence ladder, but maybe it's not a ladder at all. Maybe it's more like this vast branching tree with different species evolving totally different ways of thinking, different ways of being intelligent.
And maybe, just maybe, by studying those other forms of intelligence, those other ways of experiencing the world, we can learn to better understand our own strengths and weaknesses, and ultimately our own place here in the web of life.
That's what it's all about, isn't it? The beauty of science, the beauty of exploration. It's not really about finding all the answers, but about asking more interesting questions.
Couldn't have said it better myself. A huge, huge thank you to our amazing listeners for joining us on this deep dive into the fascinating world of chimpanzee intelligence. It's a topic that's just full of surprises, challenges, and ultimately a lot of awe and wonder. So until next time, keep those brains buzzing.